Hi, this is Brian Kim. I'm going to share with you case number 124 in the best way to do cataract surgery series. This is a patient who has an ultrabrunescent catarock, and I'm going to be performing terminal chop, cross chop, mechanical fracturing. And to me, this is really the pathway to clearer corneas postoperative day one. I'm using mechanical forces to crush these really dense nuggets of lens material into smaller and smaller pieces. And once the pieces are small enough, I use gentle pulses of ultrasonic energy to emulsify the lens pieces. And as a result, in my experience, you have much clearer corneas after surgery and better outcomes. So this is a cataract. You can see how dense it is. I'm using a corneal marker, which will help me to center and size the rexus, and using the cotton tip to manipulate the eye to do this. I make my paracentesis incision first on the right side and then the left side, making sure I'm flat to the iris plane, which allows me to create a nice corneal shelf and achieve a self-sealing incision. This is some intracameral lidocaine and then some intracameral epinephrine to help stabilize the pupil. This is intracameral air and then some trypan blue. And I like to paint the surface of the anterior capsule with trypan blue rather than indiscriminately pushing the dye into the eye. I don't want the dye to go into the vitreous space, especially in dense lenses. You can have weaker zonules, and you don't want to have that situation. And then this is some dispersive viscoelastic to coat the cornea and flatten the anterior capsule. This is a triplanar corneal incision. I make a vertical groove, place the blade deep into the groove, tunnel through the cornea, use a cannula to turn the eye towards me, and then I enter. This is a much more controlled way to titrate the length of your incision. And again, a triplanar incision, in my opinion, is really the best sealing type of incision. And then I'm going to use the cystotome. The healthy Percar forceps don't have sharp tips. And so I'm going to use the cystotome to puncture the central anterior capsule and pull the tear towards me. Again, I'm very carefully creating that tear in such a way that the radius is what I want for the rexus. So these are the Haldi Percar cross-section forceps. You can see because the teeth open up pretty widely and it also has a thin profile, it doesn't tend to cause a lot of viscoelastic egress. Very well controlled, easy to grab. I'm not having to pull centrally as I do the rexus. Finish off the rexus and burp some viscoelastic out. This is the Capsulorhexis hydrodissection technique. I place a cannula out under the rexus edge contra-incisionally, point the tip down, get a nice wave, decompress gently on the left side, and then pointing the tip down on the right, I'm able to spin the lens rather easily here. Remove some more of those bubbles. And this is a really dense cataract, and so like I said, I'm going to go ahead and start with the sculpting of the central lens. By debulking the central lens, this really helps reduce the chances for developing a posterior plate. What I was doing there was I was lifting the iris because there was a little bit of a reverse pupillary block. So I used a chopper to lift the iris there. And then we're going to go ahead with the sculpting. Normal stop and chop, you crack from the top. If you crack from the top, it's rather inefficient because if there's a dense posterior aspect, you're cracking from above and it's kind of like a Pac-Man effect. You're going to have a hinged area of lens material that's deep, and that's closer to the posterior capsule. And so that's really a rather inefficient way to chop. And so that's why this concept of terminal chop is really a more efficient way, because you place a chopper out across the equator, fracturing from deep at the terminal side of the lens. And by doing it that way, you're able to propagate the fracture deep and therefore more likely fracture the posterior plate. So I was able to get a nice chop, but it didn't propagate all the way across. And so now I'm rotating the lens 180 degrees. And then I'm going to go ahead and sculpt a little bit more. This is, again, a very, very dense lens. And even though I'm using phaco energy while I'm sculpting, you can see the lens is moving quite a bit. I'm using the chopper as an opposing force as I'm sculpting to support the lens on the other side. And now this is a terminal chop on this side and fracturing from the periphery at the equatorial side, and you can see the crack and fracture propagates all the way through. I place the chopper around the right heminucleus, pulling it centrally towards the phaco tip. With the phaco tip deep in the trough, I'm able to fracture the right heminucleus in half. I'm just cracking some more, making sure that both pieces are definitely separated. You can see I'm using that scissoring motion to fracture the deep adhesions. Using some vacuum to lift that first quadrant up, crushing the lens pieces into smaller pieces with the instruments, and then emulsifying the lens pieces. Mobilizing that second quadrant, placing the chopper around the lens piece, pulling it centrally towards the phaco tip. Again, this is another cross chop maneuver, fracturing the lens in half, separating the pieces, and then using the chopper again, getting around that fragment, pulling it up a little bit, and then fracturing it between the instruments, and then using some vacuum to lift that piece up, and then crushing the lens between the instruments. It's those deeper adhesions, that's where the problem is. And the tendency is just to go pedal to metal and just try to emulsify the whole piece. Again, it's easy to do that if you're not really patient, but again, you're going to cause damage to the corneal endothelial cells whenever you're using ultrasonic energy. Again, you might claim, oh, well, I have the cornea is coated with viscoelastic, I'm fine. Well, not always and not necessarily. And so that's why you can have rather inconsistent. Sometimes the cornea is clear, sometimes it's not, and it has to do with that. But if you have a technique that doesn't really use a lot of ultrasonic energy, and you're just fracturing the pieces into smaller pieces and then pulsing ultrasonic energy, you just have very consistently clear corneas. It's not hyperbole, it's really my clinical experience having done it this way thousands and thousands of cases. So again, another cross chop maneuver on that fragment. And then I'm just carefully positioning the lens between the instruments. I'm placing the instruments around the lens piece. You saw that very nice and controlled scissoring chop maneuver that I just did to amputate that posterior adhesion. Again, breaking the pieces into smaller pieces. And these are really, really dense pieces. These are not pieces that you can just put the pedal to the metal and it'll just kind of disappear. I mean, it really is going to cause a lot of CDE when you try to do it that way. You can see when the lens is really, really dense, it's refractile. You can see there are shards of refractile lens material. And that just is a testament to how dense this cataract is. So again, just carefully crushing the lens pieces into smaller pieces. Very well controlled. It is a little bit tedious. It takes some time. Again, if you had a family member who was having cataract surgery, I would think that you would want them to have surgery with minimal risk or complications, minimal risk of posterior capsule rupture, minimal endothelial damage. And so that's why I do the surgeries this way. I'm rotating the second heminucleus in front of me, and then coming out and pushing some more dispersive viscoelastic to coat the corneal endothelium. You saw in the beginning of the case I had quite a few bubbles, and I used that as a guide. And so as I was taking out the first couple of quadrants, you saw the bubbles slowly went away. And when those bubbles go away, that is a sign that your endothelial protection has probably gone away as well. So I'm just adding some more visco to protect the corneal endothelium. You can see most of the CDE is due to the sculpting part, not from the fracturing part. Place the chopper around the lens piece, pulling it centrally toward the figure tip. The figure tip is deep in the bag, fracturing, separating. So again, even though the figure tip is fairly deep, there is some adhesion between those lens pieces. And so I'm not placing the figure tip so deep that it's, against the posterior capsule, but deep enough that I have enough leverage where I feel like I'm fracturing most of the lens material. Using some vacuum to position that lens piece and then fracturing it once again, crushing the pieces into smaller pieces and then emulsifying the lens pieces. Using some vacuum to lift that piece up, getting under it, and this is that scissoring chop maneuver. With the chopper held sideways, I'm able to amputate the posterior adhesion. To me, this is the most efficient way to amputate the posterior adhesion. You don't want to be going after it with a figure tip and just going pedal to the metal, hoping that you'll just selectively lyse that adhesion. It doesn't work that way. You'll end up just lollipopping the lens, just creating a little bit of a core, and that's not the purpose. And so by using the instruments, you have exquisite control of amputating those posterior adhesions. And since the chopper is sideways, it's not towards the posterior capsule, and the risk for damage to the posterior capsule is really minimal. All right, so that's the third quadrant. I'm rotating that fourth quadrant in front of me, placing the chopper around the lens piece, using a little bit of vacuum to help position that lens piece. Now it's positioned. Place the phaco tip deep, fracturing the lens piece, spreading the lens piece with the instrument. There's again some posterior adhesions. Using some vacuum to control the lens, and you can see again that scissoring chop maneuver. Such a beautiful and elegant technique right there. So the scissoring chop is really an elegant way. You're using the chopper sideways, amputating the posterior adhesion. This is a very controlled method of disassembling the lens in the context of these posterior adhesions in the very dense lens. I'm able to amputate the lens pieces because that's really the hard part. When the lens is not fully disconnected from one another, that's when people run into trouble. You're trying to crack and crack and crack, and you just have this big old thing. Again, it's like the petals of a flower, but it's attached on the central core. And so that's where people get into trouble, and they have trouble really eating up the lens material because it's all stuck together. And then you get frustrated and you place the phaco tip deep, and then you break the posterior capsule. And so this way, it's really a frustrationless way. You directly place the instruments underneath the adhesion. With the chopper sideways, you're able to carefully and easily, with a scissoring chop maneuver, amputate that piece, and then you isolate the fragment you want to emulsify, and you can just very carefully, again, using mechanical forces to crush the lens pieces into smaller pieces, and then remove that lens piece. And then you can redirect your attention once that's gone to the entire mass of the lens, fracture that lens piece into smaller pieces, isolate a fragment that you want to emulsify. If there's an adhesion, use the scissoring chop method, and then remove that piece and disengage it from the rest of the lens, and then emulsify it. So I take the chopper out, push BSS in, take the phaco tip out, and I go in with the INA handpiece. I always start sub-incisionally, sweeping side to side, using some vacuum to peel off the cortex from anterior to posterior. This is the cleanest way to remove the cortex. Again, this is a very dense lens. In my experience and opinion, these cases tend to be associated with weaker zonules. You want to be really mindful about your vacuum with foot pedal control. I don't like to go pedal to the metal with the vacuum in this context. The polymer tip is very helpful. Sometimes you can grab the posterior capsule and it'll pucker up, but the posterior capsule is protected nicely due to the polymer tip. Switch to polish mode, polishing under the rhexis edge, removing the lens epithelial cells, polishing the posterior capsule surface as well. And as you polish the posterior capsule, if it puckers up very easily, again, that is a sign of some zonulopathy there. Polishing under the rhexis edge some more. You can see there's quite a bit of whitening on the paracentesis and main incision, and that's just simply due to the fluid. The fluid causes the tissues to get whitened due to stromal hydration. It has nothing to do with phaco energy. So I pulsed in the subincisional space with the BSS, and then filling the bag with the cohesive viscoelastic. In this case, I'm using the Shepherd polisher, polishing subincisionally. And you want to kind of do this gentle rotational sweep, and that just cleans up the lens epithelial cells off the rhexis edge. And if there was any cortical material subincisionally, it does a pretty good job in grabbing it and pulling it up as well. You can see the pupils come down a little bit, so you don't see the rhexis edge as well. I'm not as aggressive in this context just because I can't really see it. You can see that Shepherd polisher is also a little bit thick and has some vertical dimension to it, and so it's not always easy to get it out of the incision. I'm sweeping with the Singer sweep into the subincisional space some more. Using my diamond blade, paracentesis blade to widen the incision. Again, with these dense lenses, my default is to use a 3-piece lens. I feel like it's a better zonular support lens as well. Long term, if there's any issues, I'm able to hopefully secure the lens a little bit better with the 3-piece lens if the lens and the zonules become weak over time. I deliver the leading haptic into the bag. As the optic is delivered, I'm rotating my right hand, the wrist, counterclockwise 90 degrees so that the optic comes out planar. And I keep rotating, making sure that the trailing haptic comes out swept to the right. Obstructing my view, so I'm just using this cannula to remove some of the bubbles. Definitely want to make sure that both haptics are in the bag. Using the Maltzman, I'm going to very carefully dial the trailing haptic into the bag. I use a Maltzman to confirm that both haptics are in the bag since the pupils come down some. And I have confirmed that both haptics are in the bag. I go in with the INA, activate irrigation. I get the INA handpiece underneath the optic, tilting it and removing all the viscoelastic from within the bag. And then removing the viscoelastic from under the rhexis edge with the polish mode, and then removing the viscoelastic from the anterior chamber, and then I'll hydrate my incision. So again, this is a patient with an ultrabrunescent cataract. I use trypan blue to help my view. In these cases, if you end up running into trouble, it's really nice to be able to visualize a capsule in case there's a complication. I use generous amounts of viscoelastic to protect the corneal endothelium. And again, I use techniques that reduce ultrasonic energy. By doing it this way, I feel like I have much more control and more consistently clear corneas post-op day one. You saw that I performed terminal chop, which is again a modified stop and chop. You create a groove, but then instead of trying to crack from the top, because it's rather inefficient because you're cracking from the side that is able to be spread easily, you really need to be spreading from deep. But then if you spread too deep, you get close to the posterior capsule, and it's a little bit scary and intimidating for some. And so by fracturing it from the periphery, just like a horizontal chop technique, you're able to fracture through and through. And then following that fissure, you're able to spread, and it does tend to propagate deep, and it really is able to fracture the posterior aspect of the lens. And in this case, I had to rotate 180 degrees and fracture on the other side, but it does a really clean job of fracturing into two distinct pieces. I then perform successive cross-chop maneuvers to chop the smaller quadrants. And then you saw that there were some adhesions still nonetheless with these fragments, and I performed the scissoring chop maneuver, again, holding the chopper sideways, amputating the posterior adhesion. To me, this is the most efficient and easy way to fracture the posterior adhesion without having to really bumble around and trying to just use ultrasonic energy indiscriminately to just emulsify those pieces. You can't really sculpt those fragments. You can chop them, but it's really hard to just grab and then chop with a horizontal or vertical chop techniques. It's really not designed to go after those fragments. So the scissoring chop is just an elegant way to amputate those posterior adhesions very easily and very safely. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I thank you for your attention.